Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello again, it's Fatma Sayed. I am the Logic's dedicated coronavirus reporter. Very happy to be hosting this call from my bedroom in Mississauga, Ontario. Um, and also very happy to see so many of you on the call. A special welcome to those of you who are not subscribers and are joining us, because we have opened this call to everyone, considering these very unprecedented times. So yeah, we're happy to have all of you here. Today we'll be talking about the $82 billion COVID-19 relief plan that the federal government put out yesterday. And looking specifically at the impacts on small businesses and whether this plan helps them at all. On the line today, we have David Skok, the founder and editor-in-chief of The Logic, the publication I hope you all read. And we also have Jon Shell, who's the managing director and partner at Social Capital Partners. I'm going to hand it over to David first to give us a sense of where he is and what he's excited to talk about.
Hi, thank you, Fatima. This is my first time actually being on the receiving end of one of these conference calls, so I'm thrilled to have you hosting it. I am, like most of you, or all of you at this point, I hope, working out of my house. I have kindly and graciously, my wife has taken our son out for a very long walk. But like some of you, it's an interesting experience of trying to balance homeschooling with with running a small business. I was thinking about it the other day. It's only been a week really since the NBA canceled their season, when I think things really started to heat up for people. But I kind of view it as this tsunami, the slow, very slow moving tidal wave that we've seen out in the ocean for quite some time now. And we've known it's hit other islands, and we knew it was going to hit our island. And then it just, been watching it kind of come in very slowly and then rapidly. And it seems like it's, now overtaking the village that I can see below me. But as a small business owner, I'm wondering when it's going to hit us, as I'm sure it's hit many of you. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this call, was as much of a therapy session, a community session, to kind of just talk through some of these issues. And Jon wrote a column on the weekend, which I think encapsulated some of both the frustration and the ideas that perhaps we should be talking about during this period. So delighted to be a part of it.
Thanks, David. And I should add that the Logic's entire team has been working from home since last Thursday, I believe, or Friday. So it's been a fun experience being a newsroom when you can't actually see everyone. I'm going to turn it to Jon now, who's going to tell everyone a little bit about himself and his journey and how he's faring in his neck of the woods.
Thanks, Fatima. I think just to give you a bit of sense of background, for the purposes of this call, probably makes most sense just to focus on the small business side. I've been in and around small business for about 25 years. I had my first store in 1996. And then in 2006, started buying veterinary practices, buying and managing veterinary practices, and sold some of that to private equity, moved to Australia, built a similar company. So both of those are relatively large companies right now, and I sit on the board of both. But for the last 25 years, I've been in and around local retail, which sort of prompted my post on the weekend. When we at our office said, hey, the option, on Wednesday morning, we said the default should be working from home. And when we did that on Wednesday morning, it felt like a massive overreaction. And by Thursday, it felt completely normal. And so I think for all of us, this has been, sudden. And us and the government, everyone is trying to figure out what it all means and what we ought to do. And so, I'm sure everyone on the call is feeling a similar sense of being overwhelmed by the moment and trying to get it right.
Thanks, Jon. As David briefly mentioned, Jon wrote a column last weekend talking about how the federal government can support Canadian businesses during this crisis. David's written a column on the same topic. Yesterday, we finally saw what that support might look like. Jon, can I get your initial impressions of the plan? What's good in it? What's bad in it? What would you have liked to see more of?
I mean, sure. So the column was focused on a couple of things. It came from having a couple conversations with small business owners who I know, and they were describing what was happening in their business sort of end of last week, where revenue was going from 100% to 20%. I mean, people were seeing their revenue decline by 80% in a week. And talking about their expenses and payroll and how they were going to get through. And at the time, we had an initial government response, which was commercial rate loans from the BDC and interest rate reductions. And it made me very frustrated. And I was concerned for two groups. I mean, when you enforce social distancing, you are effectively shutting down local retail. And when you do that, there's two groups that suffer. People who don't really have full-time jobs paid by the hour. Anyone who isn't in a full-time job suffers. And of course, the local retail itself, which sees their income entirely disappear, suffers. And I think in the announcements on Wednesday, the government did some really good things about that first group, right? So figuring out a way to ensure that people who do not qualify for EI, which would have been true for a lot of people without full-time jobs, are able to get cash. And so there's moves that were made to ensure that those most vulnerable are going to be able to get enough income to pay the rent. There was nothing in there for local small business. And so there is a group that is under a ton of pressure right now, where the only offer was a 10% wage subsidy, which for a lot of these businesses, is not even going to come close to matching the impact of seeing their income entirely disappear.
David, I know you have similar concerns, but there is also, can we give kudos to the government for coming out with a plan as quickly as they have?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is unprecedented, right? There's no question. I have no doubt in my mind that people in government are working through the night trying to solve this and are as both stunned and anxious to do the right thing as everybody else. And I do think, despite some criticisms, it has to be said that our government is working on our behalf and trying its best. And I'm deeply sympathetic on a personal, individual basis for every single person in the civil service and every politician who's now out there, listening to people who are afraid and frustrated and are trying to do the right thing. So I put that caveat along with all my concerns, because I think, everybody's just doing their best in a time that we've never seen before. I think, that Jon talks about the small businesses. I also want to mention the scale-ups or the startup community, which, I've been hearing lots of frustration. Inherently, when you're in a startup at the early phases, you raise money and you're not profitable. And it seems like a lot of the policies that have come out so far, whether it's the tax deferral or the 10% salary reduction, they're not really helpful to companies that maybe we're living a little bit too close to the edge. But with all due respect, that's kind of the rules of the game when you are a startup. There's a reason why when every investor meeting I've done, the first question is, what's your burn rate? And how much runway do you have? I mean, that's you have to live close to the edge in order to make a go of it. And where I get really upset is thinking about some companies, some startups that perhaps are, close to technological or scientific breakthroughs, that were close to the edge and were in the middle of fundraising, who've now just been completely frozen. The only thing I look to really for some help there are the BDC and EDC proposals or solutions of the $10 billion in funding. But even there, those are as of right now, those seem to be on commercial loan terms. BDC released something last night that said, we will do 6-month deferments for ones that are already in our system, and also to help those companies that we deem financially viable. I reached out to BDC and have not got a response yet as to what they determine a financially viable company to be and what new terms they're willing to do to be flexible. And I should also point out that I invited Michael Denham to do this call as well, and they declined. So, the frustration for some of us in the startup community, because that's what the logic is that we just don't feel like we're being heard. It's a lot of the measures that have been put in place seem to have been, they're almost too late. A lot of the layoffs have already happened in these spaces. So anything like a 10% wage reduction for 3 months starting in April, by that point, those jobs are already gone.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are options, right? Or there were options. And Denmark, they chose to insure 75%. They provided a wage subsidy for 75% of wages up to a certain point. That was the choice to make sure that small business, whether they be startup or local retail, can keep their staff for indefinitely. We didn't make that choice. We made the choice not to do that. And I get that people are working hard, but that's fine. That means that for in Ontario, where there was a mandate that only emergency kind of required services could stay open, those jobs are already gone, right? In a lot of cases, and as long as people continue to be closed, not many people can hold out very long and still pay their people. So the question isn't really how do we save payroll at local retail. If the objective now is how do we save jobs in local retail, then we are solving last week's problem. What we need to do is solve next week's problem, which is when rent is due, and nothing that has happened yet. And there are practical ways to think through that. France has put a moratorium on rent, but those are the problems that we want to solve when we come through this in a couple of months, if we come through this in a couple of months, there will be any local retail or local small business to speak of at all.
So to contextualize the conversation a little bit, Jon, you started your column last weekend with the caveat that this isn't a, quote, financial crisis. Can you define what kind of crisis this is and how it's different from 2008, which a lot of people might remember, and why the impact on small businesses might be different this time around?
This is a short-term complete collapse of local demand, right? It is not a financial crisis. It may eventually be a financial crisis, but is not currently a financial crisis. So in 2008, right, sure, demand went down, but people went out and shopped. So if revenue went down 10%, 20%, 30%, you can get by, right? It's hard, but you can get by. This is saying you are not allowed, or you're certainly recommended to not leave your house, which means a traditional government response of trying to inject money into the economy to boost demand doesn't work. There is no money circulating through the local economy because we've asked people to stay inside. And so, you can't solve that with financial crisis related approaches. You have to solve that with approaches consistent with the burden of this crisis. And the burden of this crisis is a short-term cash crunch for people who are not in full-time jobs and for people with small businesses.
David, based on that definition, how do you think our reaction should be tailored to best assist small businesses?
Well, I mean, I get John's John. I get your take on it, in through that small lens. But we also have to recognize that the stock market has lost, many trillions of dollars over the last few weeks as well. Not to mention the price of oil collapsing. Not to mention the dollar now dropping below 70 cents. And so there are a lot of issues here that are going to snowball to make this a financial crisis as well. And I think that's, the government is trying to rectify all of that stuff, or cope with all of these different things. It's four different things happening at once. And I'm not an economist, so I don't pretend to know what those solutions may be. But I do think swift, decisive, bold action. You're looking at Spain putting 20% of its GDP, New Zealand with 4% of its GDP, France with a lot, and basically saying we're going to give you 0% interest loans just to get through this.
Well, some are saying that, David, loans are not the solution in a lot of these countries, right? I mean, Canada has decided to lead with loans, but others haven't, and that's important.
Well, they're using what other tools are they using?
No rent, no utility payments, larger wage subsidies, things that are targeted at the places where this burden is falling, right? I mean, the impact of a falling stock market, and I don't mean to debate, but I think that we need to triage urgency, and I think the government did a really good job of attacking the most urgent problem, which are individuals who have entirely lost their income, and how do we get them cash through mechanisms that currently exist right away. And so I thought they did a really good job of that. I think we need to think about what's the next, in that triage, what's the next most urgent issue. And that is, in small and medium-sized business, bills that they need to pay, and where the use of BDC and others to provide loans, when you are providing those loans through people who are used to a particular way of evaluating credit, there's no way we can execute on that in time. So I believe that's why other countries have taken a more direct, expense-based approach to managing this second most urgent economic issue that we need to triage.
Jon, can you give us an example of a business that would benefit from that kind of response, that would address rent and overhead costs and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of your local retailer, like your daycare, coffee shops, independent gyms, co-working spaces, like these are places whose income has gone to zero and who have largely laid off their staff or will be laying off their staff. And so the question is, how do we get those people through the next couple of months? And the only way for them to stretch out the cash they have is to figure out a way to either reduce or eliminate their rent, to pause their utility payments. We can get them a cash infusion by provincial governments putting a pause on the collection of sales tax, right? So they would, businesses collect sales tax and hold it, and then they remit it to government. If we could pause on that remittance, that gets them cash. They still have to pay it later on, but it gets them cash for now, because we're just trying to make sure they can make it through. I've talked to some people who have spoken to their landlords about working to get through the next few months, and frankly, the response so far has not been very good. And in order to and I think that's why France mandated it, and they mandated it at the same time as putting a pause on mortgage payments, right? Because then you go up the line. So that's, I think, the lens that we need to take is and just to put a personal take on this, I think we talk about business as this thing. You think of a corporation with a lot of people working for it and shareholders. For a lot of small businesses in this country, these are jobs for people, right? So the owners are often making enough money to have a job. And they've also personally guaranteed, in very many cases, not just loans that they've received to start their business, but they're leases. So it's not even a matter for them of saying, okay, I'm just going to close shop and now I don't have to pay my rent. A lot of those leases are personally guaranteed, right, on their houses. So, we've said, and when we shut off all demand, we're effectively firing all of those owners, right? We are preventing you from getting income. And so a lot of this burden is falling on them. We fired them and their expenses remain in a lot of cases. So that's how you start to, so you have to start to attack the expense side for those groups.
Can I just jump in there? And so, John, walk us through then the trickle up effect of that. So you forgive the rent. Now a landlord or a property owner is on the hook and has to pay the mortgage for that building.
Yeah.
Maybe. Who forgives their mortgage, commercial mortgage, which I don't think I've seen as part of this yet. The banks. And so now we move up from the banks, and who's forgiving the banks, and on we go.
But
so
there isn't that much on we go from there, right? So banks add a couple months of principal payments to the end of an amortization, and then work on an equitable burden sharing with government and landlords on interest costs, right? The government could loan money to municipalities in order to pause property tax, right, in order to give the landlords even more space. But at some point, and that's starting to happen, right? Like some banks are beginning to work with landlords on mortgages, but there's no enforcement mechanism to ensure that trickles all the way through, right? I mean, in Alberta, I believe they've just paused utility payments, which is another massive expense, and so provinces can start to do that. So there's a number of things that can be done, but on the rent side, there are absolutely ways to postpone and mitigate mortgage costs, debt costs for landlords in order to enable rent to be waived for a couple of months.
We talk a lot about small businesses. Are there other aspects of the the economy, the labor force, and so forth that are at risk from this crisis and that aren't necessarily being helped through the plan? David, I'll turn to you first.
Sorry, I was a little distracted. To my dear friend Gord McIntosh, who I don't know, but I'm delighted you're here. We can all see your screen, so you may want to just stop the screen share on your device. Sorry, Fatima, could you repeat the question?
Sure. I know we focus a lot on small businesses. Are there other aspects of the economy, of business, of the labor force that are at risk from this crisis and that maybe aren't being helped by the plan that was put out yesterday?
On this front, I have to say, I think the government's doing a good job of thinking about the workers, and the EI extensions, the short-term leave extensions, the childcare benefits. It's obviously difficult and it's happened so suddenly, but I actually think in terms of what toolkits it had, I actually think that they're more attuned to that than they are to a lot of the other things. Although to John's point, I think there's a lot more that can be done on that side. But I really think that I think corporate Canada has a good ear in Ottawa right now, and hopefully, whether it's the banks, the telcos, they're having those conversations. But I do think that the small to medium sized business, the tech companies, are the ones that are kind of getting a little bit left behind in this conversation. Not to mention when you factor in the energy companies in the energy sector. But Morneau has said that more is going to be coming on that end down the road.
Well, I was going to ask, what does the next phase of this relief plan look like, or what should it look like? John?
Well, I think I've outlined that. I mean, I think the next in the triage is small and medium-sized business finding a way to reduce their expenses with some sort of equitable burden sharing between the people who can afford to do that. I think there will be. I think we will see the next phase deal with what David just talked about, some of the industries that are in crisis. And my real worry is that we'll skip over small and medium-sized business. That we'll think back to the 2008, 2009 playbook, where it was larger industries that were the ones that were suffering that we dealt with. They're easier to do because you can talk to the CEO of 10 companies and work things through. So I'm worried that the next thing we'll focus on is sort of the larger industries that are at risk, and we'll end up skipping over the issues of small business and medium-sized business. And I had someone reach out to me on leases, right? So a lot of medium-sized businesses who have a significant number of equipment leases where their revenue has collapsed. There needs to be some form of relief, because really what we're trying to do is survive, right? Because we believe that if we can contain this over a couple of months, then we can come out the other end. And so, it's what are the broad-based measures we can use to enable a business, where you can't talk to 10 CEOs, where they're really broadly distributed across the country, where we can provide relief to allow those businesses to survive. And I'm really hopeful that that's what this next phase looks like.
I mean, one of the
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one of the biggest uncertainties right now is we don't know how long this crisis is going to go on for, right? So what kind of timeline does any kind of relief package need to have?
Yeah, that is the question to me, and I'm not sure most Canadians are, even in just my anecdotal conversations, are aware of how long this could go. I was talking to a journalist in Hong Kong last night, and Hong Kong put in place their school closings at the end of January, and they have now just extended it past April 15th because they now have, they beat the first wave, but now they have an influx of tourists coming in or people from other countries who are infecting again. And so, anybody who thinks that this isn't going to be a long period of time where we're all working remotely, where we can't go out, is I think fooling themselves right now. And so at minimum, in my view, 3 months, but theoretically, if we can't find a vaccine or get a vaccine accelerated through, we need to be prepared for 12 to 18 months of hardship here. Well, so go ahead, Jon.
No. I think that's right, but I think we need to think about taking this in terms of options, right? So, I spoke to someone in the government today who was talking about 18 months, and if it's 18 months, then there's nothing we can do. I mean, if it's 18 months of social distancing, then there's literally nothing we can do for a ton of businesses. Like they're gonna go under, and that will be awful, and we will have to rebuild the economy literally from scratch. But I think we might as well try to figure out an approach that will keep this economy going, assuming we can stop the social distancing, or at least ease the social distancing in a couple of months. Because frankly, I don't know how long you're going to be able to maintain this level of social distancing without some kind of real unrest. So I think from a planning perspective, I think it makes sense to continue to plan for returning to this economy in a couple of months, because if we don't, then all bets are off, and this economy might be over anyway.
I have several more questions, but I do want to open the floor. If any of our listeners have questions, feel free to raise your hand. There is a button on Zoom, if you could see it, and we can defer to you, or write it in the chat, and I'd be happy to ask on your behalf. We want this to be as constructive and useful as possible, so please do participate if you want to. Jon, to follow up the last point that you made, we're not doing much to increase consumer demand, are we, through these relief packages? It seems like a lot of the money that's being given at the moment is just the bare minimum to get people to get by as they're social distancing.
Well, let's talk about the impact of providing money for consumer demand right now, because I think that's really important, because that's one of the standard approaches to dealing with a recession, right, or dealing with any type of demand crisis. And the challenge is we are, so even if we were to do that, let's say we sent everyone $1,000, like they've done in other places, where's that money going to get spent, right? Where at the same time we're telling people not to go outside, or at least not to go to shops. So that money will get spent on Amazon, right? Or it'll get kept. Like, there is no mechanism, and this is why we need to take such a different approach to solving this crisis, is because there is no mechanism to deliver demand to small business when you've asked them not to open. So that's that's the real reason why the traditional approaches to this isn't going to work, and I think that's why Trudeau keeps saying, let's keep some fiscal capacity for when we get out of this, because I think he understands that once we're able to shop again, we're going to need to inject some demand into the economy, and I think there's some logic to that. But you don't want to keep too much back, so that by the time you're ready to do that, it'll be you don't have local business to go back to.
David, we have a question from the floor. What do you think about the government securing loans for small business? This question comes from the Workaround, which is a co-working space in Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jon and I are different on this one. As we've said before, that I think it's essential right now. Low to zero interest loans that can allow businesses to still operate. But the flip side is, I take Jon's point that most of these businesses have already shut their doors. So to be blunt about it, what's the point? The logic is in a bit of a different situation where we're still open for business. And in fact, I think our reporters are doing the best work I've ever seen. This is not a story that I've ever covered before in my life. And I think we still are one of the few that is very fortunate where we can keep going, provided that subscribers keep being willing to support that. I think my answer has changed or evolved over the last 4 days on this one a little bit, but I do think more than $10 billion right now, I think, is not an unfair ask or an unreasonable ask on this front. And we've seen the provinces start to step in where the feds aren't able to, and I suspect that will continue.
And just to provide a different point of view, I think those loans will be helpful in some cases, and I think will largely be completely and utterly impractical. And there's also a moral argument against it. So the reason it's impractical is you're asking people who are used to a certain approach to evaluating credit to say, we don't care anymore. It doesn't matter if the income's down to zero and they've laid off their employees, and there's no way to create a credible business plan. We're still going to loan them money. It's just completely impractical. But in cases like David's, I think these things make some sense, but that can't be the end. We can't assume that by providing loans through sort of traditional credit distributors, we'll be able to get to the people we need to get to, and that those loans will be appropriately approved.
Another question from one of our listeners: do either of you see the global talent stream being hurt as we go through this crisis? The Marianne Bulger says, at the moment, if a GTS worker is let go and they haven't applied for permanent residency, they are told to immediately report to a port of entry. What is the government doing to protect or support them, if anything at all?
Yeah, I can take this. Actually, I was talking to two people last night who rely on the GTS, and their workers have been shut out. All I can say is I've heard that this is a topic being raised at the most senior levels of government. They're aware of it. We haven't reported it, but I I do know that it is something that is being talked about, and because a lot of companies, not just companies that rely on the talent here, but also you have the yeah, it is a known issue, and it's one that they're working through. I think what we heard in Fatima, you've done the reporting on this, but the U.S. Canada border closure, the reason why it was delayed relative to everyone else was just around the complications, particularly with the U.S. when it comes to trade, foreign goods, and everything else. But those global talent stream workers, not all of them, but a lot of them do come via the U.S. And so they're trying to figure it out. But that's all I can tell you.
Yeah, there were some brief reports yesterday about how the temporary foreign program and the seasonal foreign program won't be impacted by the border closures, that this would still be coming in. But if you refer to yesterday's coronavirus roundup that we published, we spoke to a farmer who is concerned because he hasn't heard anything otherwise. And he's just, he's just been able to get 6 men to help out with blueberry picking, and is worried that it's going to disrupt the agriculture industry very significantly. So we'll have to watch that and see how it plays out. Jon, do you think that the province can step in to fill some of the gaps in the relief program that was announced yesterday by the federal government?
I do. I think there's two areas. One around utilities, one around deferring of sales tax. So I think in what Jason Kenney did in Alberta, I think it applies to business as well, was suspend utilities payments. And then the province has a really interesting mechanism of saying you just keep the sales tax you've collected for a period of time to get cash into the pockets of business right away.
David, would you like to add to that? What's the role provinces can play in this crisis?
They're working on stuff. I'm actually, after this call, I'm trying to get in touch with someone in Ontario. I know that they're trying to work on something. Obviously, Kenny and Alberta have announced something. They are working. One of the challenges is, and this kind of speaks to Jon's point on the, asking people who normally assess credit to just give out money, is it's really a delivery mechanism. It's, okay, now how do we get this money to the firms that need it? And, just to point out, the BDC's website has crashed twice today already because they are so overloaded with applicants, I suspect. That's me making a leap here. But somebody's got to go through those applications and determine who gets in and who doesn't. And I think the biggest challenge that governments are wrestling with right now is logistics, quite frankly. How do you make that determination?
I think before I know we're in sort of question period, but I think it's there's an urgency element of this that's worth talking about, right? And almost all businesses, from startups through to retail, operate on a monthly expense cycle. So it may be that people will get through March. A certain number of businesses, if nothing changes in terms of support, a certain amount of businesses will close in April because they won't make it through, and then you're going to see an exponential. You'll see an exponential curve in terms of businesses closing down over a period of months. So there's not a lot of time. We're probably not going to sacrifice that many businesses if this isn't solved by April 1st, but there'll be some. But if we don't have cash in the hands of the businesses that need them, sometime in April, I think you're going to see a much higher percentage of businesses close down in May.
There are several Toronto small businesses and companies that also operated in the United States. I've seen 2 questions from our listeners about the impact the border closures, but just this crisis will have for these companies that do businesses both in Canada and the United States. Any thoughts on how they can find supports?
I will just say, the U.S. has more aggressively focused on giving money to businesses. So there may be more give in the system on their end than there is on ours. But I don't, we have vendors I have to pay as well in the US, and I'm certainly, not going to be in a rush to make those payments. So what'll that do on their side? I don't know.
If there are no more questions, I'll end with one of mine. Everything seems very bleak right now. So can I ask both of you to, offer one piece of advice to small businesses navigating this right now, and perhaps a note of optimism for these business owners and workers?
So I have a few optimistic ones, if you'd like, because I've been very dour on this call. I'm feeling very bad about that. So a friend of mine who owns, I would say, a medium-sized distribution business, wrote to their bank, last week, not last week, I think a couple of days ago, in fact, and said, "Hey, look, here's what's happening. I'm really worried about the next few months. Can you help out?" And the bank, I believe it was RBC, wrote back a wonderful note about what they were willing to do. I mean, he'd said, "Look, when can we meet? I'm not, I understand working from home." And they said, "We don't need to meet. Here's what we're prepared to do." And it was really quite generous. And I have heard, while most of the landlord stories I've heard have been bad, I've heard some good ones as well. And so I think there are people who are, trying to do the right thing, recognizing the challenge that people have that they've never faced before, and I think that's positive. I think the advice I would give is I don't think it is possible for there not to be some form of additional help coming. It may take a bunch of businesses closing before that happens. I hope it doesn't. But my advice is, just hang on. Don't, as many bills as you can avoid paying, don't pay them. If there are bills where people are being adamant, still don't pay them. Just try to get through the next couple of months, because I really do believe over the next few weeks to a month, they're going to have to do something. So hang on.
David, before you answer, I'm sorry, we do have a few more questions come in, and we have some time, so I thought we could address them very quickly. There's a question about startups that rely on exporting and selling internationally. Is there any advice you can offer to how they can continue working in the logistics industry and maintain their international connections?
I don't know. It's a good thing for us to pursue, maybe include in a briefing item. Their deal came together on, particularly in the U.S. case, in 15 hours or so. So I bet they're still working through this stuff. But my only suggestion would be to check the global affairs and the international trade websites. I will give the government credit. They're trying to do a lot of communication the right way. And most of the answers that you're looking for can be found on those websites. But we'll see if we can dig it up and provide an answer in one of our channels.
Thanks, David. Now I'm turning to you for some optimism and some advice.
Yeah, people forget. Canada looks back at the 08-09 Great Recession and pats itself on the back a lot for how we got through it. And it's worth remembering, if you go back and look at Jim Flaherty was the finance minister at the time. It took him a few months to get it. He didn't quite act as quickly as we remember or would like to remember. And they ended up putting in place a very large stimulus package, which was a stimulus very different to what's needed today. But they ended up reacting. It just took a little bit of time. And that led to the Canada Economic Action Plan, which was helpful in getting people out of this. So, I do think people are shell-shocked, and government are human beings as well. And I think they're shell-shocked and are adjusting to this new normal. And the new normal keeps changing every day. And so if there's just a little bit of time, it was only a week ago that Trudeau unveiled the $1 billion response for, medical supplies and health emergencies. And now yesterday we got the larger package. So to Jon's point, I think more help will come. It sadly and tragically is going to be really late for a lot of companies. And I see Leah's point there about 97% of businesses in Canada are SMEs and employ 90% of the workforce. It's going to be really rough, but more help will be coming. And the other thing I'd say is, if I may just, on the humanity side of things, this is, if you look at where Canada, the discourse of this country was going, the polarization that was increasing, the questions, legitimate questions that have been brought up about the federalism as a whole more broadly, and whether some provinces would break off and become independent. Watching the first ministers work together on this file has been heartwarming, and seeing how Canadians have actually galvanized as Canadians on this. There's a lot that hope, one day we'll all look back on this, and my hope is that it'll be a turning point for our country in unifying again, like it was for those who lived through the awful tragedies of the World War I and World War II. But I think we're in the same level here of scope of the problem, and that also can be a galvanizing moment for us as a country.
I want to thank David and Jon both for sharing their insights and their advice, and ending on an optimistic note for me and for all of you. The logic is living and breathing everything related to COVID-19 right now. If you're a small business, please feel free to get in touch with your stories. Anything we can chase, lead, help figure out, we'd be happy to do so. We're going to have several more calls like this about various different topics related to this crisis, I'm sure. So if you weren't able to ask your questions today, there will be another opportunity.
Fatima, can I interrupt you there just for 1 second, and just to give a call out to you and to the entire reporting team? Along with everybody else, these reporters are living through this and trying to process it all. I don't think any of them have slept more than 4 hours over the last week and a half. And I think the coverage has been, some of the best in the world that I've seen. And I'm incredibly proud to work alongside all of you. And for those listening who are not subscribers, I understand the economic challenges that we're all in. But right now, supporting their work, it's more than charity, it's information, and it's really important. And so I hope that you'll consider it. And if not, we'll keep making it available to as many of you as possible for as long as we can afford to. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thanks, David. I will say this is my first recession as a working adult. I was too young for the 2008 one. So it's a learning curve for a lot of us. Thank you for tuning in. There will be a recording available. If you're a subscriber, it will be in the Slack council. If you're not, you can email us. There was an email dropped in the chat. We will drop it in here again. And stay safe out there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.